Good morning. For more than a decade, the students of Mansfield High School have had the privilege of hearing the story of Holocaust survivor Janet Singer Applefield. The presentation you'll hear this morning is designed to raise awareness and understanding of the dangers of prejudice. In addition, I hope it empowers each of you to stand up to any kind of discrimination and injustice you may encounter in your day-to-day lives. At the conclusion of her presentation, we'll have a question and answer session from the audience. Questions can be submitted to me during the presentation or after using the comment button. Ms. Applefield earned her Master's of Social Work at Boston University. As a clinical social worker, she has counseled a variety of patients, from juvenile offenders convicted of hate crimes to geriatric populations. She currently provides psychotherapy and behavior management services to nursing home patients. On behalf of the Mansfield school community, it is my pleasure to welcome our special guest this morning, Ms. Janet Singer Applefield.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hawking. I speak to thousands of students and adults every year to tell the story of how I survived the Holocaust. The Holocaust was one of the most vicious and heinous crimes in the history of mankind. As a result of World War II, between 50 million and 60 million people were killed. 6 million Jewish people were murdered because the Nazis had a particular hatred against Jews, and they were determined to kill all Jews of Europe. 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered. Only 11% survived, and I was one of those very lucky children. So I speak to thousands of students with the hope that it will promote greater awareness and understanding of prejudice and racism. Today, as I speak to you, my talk will be charged with more emotion because I am upset. I'm very upset. I feel sadness, disappointment, and outrage due to the racism, inequality, and injustice we're seeing in America. What is happening before our very own eyes is hurting my heart. The images of George Floyd being killed are difficult to look at. America is in crisis. When we teach history, it is our hope and expectation that we will learn important lessons so that we will not repeat the mistakes of the past. Tragically, we have not learned those lessons. We must not only fight actions of violent people, but also we must motivate the good people into action. Many of my family members were murdered due to discrimination and hatred simply because of their religious beliefs. That is why I feel so passionate about sharing my story with you. Today, I plead with you to make a commitment to make a difference. I too accept the challenge and pledge to be an instrument of change. What I find so frightening and disheartening is that there are so many similarities of how events unfolded in Europe before World War II. I have recollections, and I heard my father speak about the discrimination that was going on in Poland and rest of Europe before the war. There was discrimination against Jewish students. They couldn't attend university, law schools, medical schools. There were pickets in front of my grandfather's store, people carrying hateful slogans saying, "Don't shop in a Jewish store." So I was born in Krakow, Poland, and I lived with my mother, father, baby sister in a little town 50 miles south of the city of Krakow. I lived there with large extended family, grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles. I have really wonderful, warm memories of those first few years of my life because they were very good ones and very happy ones. By the way, my birth name was not Janet. My birth name was Gustava. And throughout my childhood, my name changed 3 different times. Also, my appearance had a lot to do with my survival because I looked like a typical Aryan child. I was blonde and I had certain features, and so I fit that profile because the Nazis were trying to develop a master race, and they thought people should have a certain appearance. I have warm memories of those first few years of my life. I had an uncle who had a motorcycle. He would, with a little sidecar, he'd put me in there, take me for rides. I remember preparing for holidays with my mother and my grandmother. Well, very abruptly, everything came to an end. Our life were changed dramatically. September 1st, 1939, it was the beginning of World War II. My father told me he was awakened 5 o'clock in the morning. He heard the announcer say that Poland was attacked. So the first few days of the war were confusing and chaotic. My father sent me and my mother and my baby sister to my other grandparents' home in another little town. When we arrived there, everybody was packing up their belongings and running away, heading away from the fighting, heading in the direction of Russia. My grandfather packed up some of our belongings onto a horse and wagon, and we headed east. I was just 4 years old when the war started. I remember that ride because it was very scary and difficult. There were planes overhead shooting at us. We had to jump off the wagon and hide in a ditch and waited till the shooting stopped. I remember seeing an airplane that was shot down, it burned and it crashed. After several weeks of such very difficult travel, we arrived at our destination. Now, my father and his brothers tried to join the Polish army, but Poland was defeated in 1 month's time. And when that happened, my father and my uncles joined this caravan of people that was constantly streaming out of Poland and heading to Russia. When my father first arrived, he didn't know where we were. Of course, communication in those days was difficult. Not very many people had telephones, and certainly there were no cell phones. So my father advertised in the newspaper looking for us, and in time he was able to find us. Life in Russia was extremely harsh, very, very difficult. There was shortage of food and a shortage of work. And one day there was an announcement made that all the people from that were looking for work should report at a town hall. My father wasn't feeling well that day, so he didn't go, but my 2 uncles went. And when they arrived there was a marching band playing. They were told to sing nationalistic songs, and then they were marched to a nearby ravine. They were told to take off their clothes, and they were shot into the ravine. So my 2 uncles were murdered. The other thing that happened that was extremely tragic was that my little baby sister got sick. She contracted diphtheria. Diphtheria is an illness we no longer get because when babies are little in this country, they're vaccinated against this terrible disease. But in those days, there was no such vaccine and there was no medical treatment because it was wartime. And my baby sister died. She was just 18 months old, sorry. After we were in Russia for several months, there was an order issued that all the people that came to Russia from Poland, and there were about 200,000 Polish nationals that crossed the border, all those people, in order to be allowed to stay and work, had to take out Russian citizenship. The family was divided. They didn't know what to do. They were afraid. My parents were afraid to do that. Their thinking was that when the war would be over, they couldn't go back to Poland and get their property back. So we decided to go back to Poland. My grandparents stayed, and aunt and uncle stayed. Those people were put onto trains and sent off to a region of Russia called Siberia. Siberia is an area where the weather is extremely harsh. They were sent to slave labor camps. My grandmother died there. When we arrived back in our town, all the Jewish people were forced to live in a ghetto. Now, the ghettos in big cities had high cement walls with barbed wire on top and guarded entrances. This ghetto was open. It did not have any walls around it. All the Jewish people were forced to wear armbands to identify themselves as Jews. Every day there were roundups of people. Some were sent to slave labor camps. Others were taken to the local cemetery, made to dig their own graves and shot into the graves. My parents decided that we would try to escape. So one night we left our apartment and we went to the train station. Train stations were very dangerous because that's where often the plainclothes Gestapo, secret police would be. But we managed to take a train and we ended up in another town where my mother had cousins living. When we arrived there, my parents saw and realized that it was a very similar situation because the Nazis were very well organized. Once again, they decided that we would try to escape. So one night, it was August 1942, my father got a horse and wagon and we started to drive out of town. It was a very bright night. The moon was out. We didn't get very far when suddenly in the distance, we noticed Polish police approaching on horseback. We jumped off the wagon and we started to run. And you might be wondering why we would be running, why we would be afraid of the Polish police. And the reason for that was that Poland was an very anti-Semitic country. There were prejudice against Jewish people. And often the Polish police cooperated and collaborated with the Nazis. So we were scared and we started to run and we ended up in these fields where there were potato plants growing. Well, potato plants are not very tall, so we were not successful. They found us, they beat us up, and they made us return. And at that point, my parents realized that there was nowhere to run, nowhere to escape. They were desperately trying to find someone who'd be willing to take me and hide me. They were able to convince a woman, her name was Maria. Maria was a nanny to one of my cousins. They begged Maria to take me, and she agreed. And one day my parents sat me down and explained that I was going to go with Maria, that I should be good, I should listen, and that we would be reunited very soon. So I left with her. In the meantime, my parents again decided that they were not going to go, there was another order issued that stated that the people from this town and all the surrounding towns had 3 days to report at an area outside of Krakow. They decided they would separate from each other. Their thinking was that if they separated, maybe, just maybe, one of them would survive. So they left on that, and they got to this appointed place. And when they arrived, there were approximately 12,000 people congregated in this huge, huge field. It was very hot. It was August. There was no water, there was no food, and there was no place for them to sleep. And then there was a selection. A selection meant that there was a group of SS officers who made a decision who would live and who would die. Approximately 1,000 men were selected for slave labor. My father was one of those men. The rest of the people were put into 53 boxcars marked with the letter B. Between 120 and 150 people were put into each boxcar. It was so crowded, they could not lie down. They could not sit, they could only stand, and the ride took 5 days. When they arrived, they were taken off the train. Some of the people, they were being sent to the concentration camp called Bełżec, on the eastern front of Poland, Bełżec. When they arrived, people were taken off the train. Some people were already dead because there was a white disinfectant on the floors that gave off toxic fumes. The people were taken off and sent to the gas chamber. It took only 3 hours from the time they left the train to when they were killed. Only 2 people survived this camp. This camp existed 6 months, and in that period of time, 600,000 people were murdered. My mother, my grandmother, my aunt, my cousins, and other family members were victims of that camp. When the Nazis learned how to kill more efficiently, they opened the concentration camp called Auschwitz. They burned this camp to the ground. Today there's a monument there and a museum. Now my father was sent to the Krakow ghetto. Every morning at 5 a.m, he and other prisoners were taken and marched over to a cable factory. My father worked on an assembly line making electrical cables. He told me he kept a little photograph of me, and he said the only reason he wanted to live was knowing that he gave me away and he had to live for me. My father was starving because they were given very little to eat. He did have a German foreman who every once in a while would give my father an extra piece of bread. And of course, my father was so very grateful for that. While my father was still living in the ghetto, the Nazis were building the concentration camp called Płaszów on the outskirts of the city of Krakow. When that camp was completed, the Krakow ghetto was liquidated and all the people were sent to the concentration camp. Now, I left with Maria. Maria had an apartment in the city. I remember so well being in that apartment because there would be times when she would go out in the evening, leave me alone. She would lock the door and leave me alone. I was really scared because there was no electricity in that apartment. So I was crying and I was trying to unlock the door, but of course I couldn't. One day there was a sharp knock on the door. Maria opened the door. There was Gestapo standing there, and the man said, "I have orders to search your apartment to see if you're hiding any Jews." He barged in. He turned some of the furniture over. He looked under the furniture. He came up to me, held up my braid. He wanted to know who I was. Maria said that I was her niece. She was taking care of me because her sister was sick. He looked at me with his chilling blue eyes, and he turned around and he left. And to this day, I remember what he looked like. He was blonde. He had blue eyes. He was wearing black leather boots that came up to his knees, and I could hear the clicking of his heels as he went down the steps. Now, my father knew that he had to make different arrangements for me because Maria told him she could not keep me indefinitely. She was risking her life. My father was able to contact a cousin who was living on falsified Polish papers. She had Polish identity. Her Polish name was Halina Wałkowska. So one day, my care was transferred from Maria to my cousin. My cousin was a young woman. She was only 19. And she was able to get a birth certificate from a Catholic priest of a little Polish Catholic girl that died. And I took on this girl's identity. I became her. Her name was Kristina Antoshkevich. So I became Kristina, and my new nickname was Krisha. Actually, my name was changed 3 different times, so this was my second name. My birth name was Gustava, and my new name was Kristina. I went to live with my cousin. She was just 19 years old, very confident, very brazen. There would be times when we would take the trolley car in the city. She would always tell me to be quiet, not to speak, because Polish people were not permitted to ride in front of the trolley. They had to sit in the back. The front was reserved for Germans. But because my cousin spoke German fluently and I didn't, because she was so brazen, we would sit in the front. We lived in another little town outside of the city of Krakow. She was very mean to me. She used to beat me with a fireplace poker. And when I cried for my mother, she would say, "Your mother is dead. She's never coming back for you." One time she beat me so severely that all my fingernails turned black, they got infected, and all my nails fell off. There was a nice woman who lived next door. Her name was Janina. Janina, I remember when my fingers were so badly injured, made bandages for my fingers. And sometimes my cousin would go out for the whole day, leave me outside, lock the door. I'd have to sit on the front stoop, cold and hungry, in my pajamas. Janina was nice. Sometimes she would give me a piece of bread to eat. Sometimes I would play with her baby. There were times when I had to take these very heavy boxes to the post office. They were so big and heavy that I could barely carry them. And at the time, I didn't know what was inside those boxes. But later I found out. So my cousin had a Polish boyfriend that used to come and visit with her. He had a shoe factory in town, but behind the shoe factory, they were making ammunition. So inside those boxes were shoes and boots, but in the shoes and boots were guns, hand grenades, bullets. And I was mailing these boxes to different resistance groups throughout Poland because my cousin was in the Polish resistance. One day, my cousin told me she was going to go to the city to meet her boyfriend, and she took me with her. When we arrived in the city, she took me into a church, and she told me to sit and wait for her while she was going to meet her boyfriend across the street in a cafe. I sat and I waited and waited and waited, but she never came back for me. So finally, I walked out of the church. It was late afternoon. I saw that the whole street was cordoned off. I crossed the street. I overheard people talking, and I heard them say that the Gestapo, the secret police, had come and they arrested everybody in that cafe. So here I was, 7 years old, walking up and down the street, crying. I didn't know what to do, where to go. Suddenly, a woman came up to me very, very quickly. She put me under her cape and said, "Why are you crying? What's wrong?" I explained that my cousin was in that cafe over there. I pointed, and now she was gone. I said, "Could you please take me to the bus? I was going to go back to my village." And she said, "No, because you're too little." She took me into the building, the same building where the cafe was, but upstairs, to the apartment of a woman by the name of Alicia. Alicia asked me, "Who are you? Where are you from? What happened?" I had a story that I practiced to tell if I was ever captured. And the story was that I was the daughter of a Polish officer, that both of my parents had killed in a bombing raid, and I was living with my cousin, and now she was gone. Alicia said I could stay there, but actually I couldn't stay in that apartment for 3 reasons. One was that there was an SS officer living in the building. Another reason was that Alicia's mother was very active in the Polish resistance, and in her apartment she ran a hospital and she had shortwave radios and ammunition. And the third reason was that when the Gestapo made an arrest, they would always return for a second time. So they were afraid to leave me there. So that early evening, the oldest son, Stashek, took me and we walked for several miles and we came to a farm that was owned and operated by the Catholic Church, and Alicia's brother-in-law was the administrator of the farm. So I remained on the farm. I remember one time we had slaughtered a pig and they were cutting up the carcass in the kitchen. Now, Polish people were forbidden to kill animals for their own consumption. That was strictly reserved for Germans. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Someone came to tell us that the Gestapo was on the way. Very quickly, we cleaned everything up. We hid it in the attic, and we waited, and they came. It was not unusual for the Gestapo to drop in. They could come anytime to pick up provisions such as cheese, butter, eggs. So when they came, I was really scared because I was always afraid of uniforms. I don't know what made me do this, but I said, give them vodka. So they were given vodka. And then I started to sing and dance. And they were drinking and laughing at me. And finally they left. My father told me of an incident that happened to him in the concentration camp. One night, in the middle of the night, he had to use the bathroom, which was outside. A guard saw him. My father found a cigarette stub and he was smoking. And a guard saw him and shot him in the face. The bullet lodged under my father's cheekbone and just had to stay there because, of course, he could not get any medical treatment. When the Nazis realized that they were losing the war, they wanted to destroy any evidence. So they had the prisoners, my father included, dig up the very shallow graves all around this camp. There were thousands and thousands of bodies. So my father's job was to dig up the bodies, put them in a big pile, and burn them. He said he could not get the smell out of his nostrils of the burning bones and flesh for a long, long time. When that job was completed, the Nazis burned the camp to the ground. Today, there's just a monument standing there. The remaining prisoners were marched to other concentration camps. My father ended up in 3 different camps. We were liberated by the Russians. I remember when the war was coming to an end because they were fighting all around the farm. And we too had to use the outhouse, so we were risking our lives when we went outside. It was so dangerous that it was decided that we had to go back to the city. So we moved back to Krakow. And I remember when there were bombings, and in the middle of the night, there would be sirens to tell us that a bombing was going to happen. We had to get up, and we all carried candles to the cellar. All the people from the apartment building, we all carried candles, and we sat in a cellar. There were benches all around the room, and we waited until the bombing stopped. When the war ended, my cousin's father found where I was. He found me, and he came to get me. I really didn't want to go with him. I was afraid of him, just the way I had been afraid of his daughter. But the family didn't feel they had a right to keep me because he was my relative, so I left with him. He didn't keep me very long. He turned me over to a refugee center in Krakow. So I was 10 years old when the war ended, and I went to live in the refugee center. I was there with approximately 70 children like myself. Some were a little older, some younger. Every day there were lists posted on the wall with names of survivors, and along came a woman. Her name was Lena. Lena came every day looking at the list, trying to find her child and sister and husband, and she came across this room full of children, and she made a decision that she had to do something for the children. So in time, she was able to open 2 orphanages. I remember very well the night we had to leave for the orphanage. We had to leave in the middle of the night because there were men and women picketing in front of the refugee center, carrying hateful slogans saying we all should have been murdered. So we climbed into the trucks. They pulled tarpaulin covers over us. One of the trucks was for children who had tuberculosis or other infectious diseases because Polish hospitals refused to take Jewish children. So they had to open a second orphanage. So I went to live in the orphanage. Only the high school age children were sent to public school, but every day they came back, they were beaten up by the Polish children. Lena went to the school pleading with the teachers and the principal to protect the children, but they didn't. And Lena was always afraid that our home would be attacked because the other orphanage was attacked 3 different times. And finally it was decided that it was too dangerous to keep it open. So they closed it, and those children came to live with us. So because Lena was so afraid that we would be attacked, the older children were trained in use of ammunition. And one night, a Polish lady knocked on the door. She came to tell us that our home was going to be attacked. So the children took their positions on the balcony, on the terrace, and on the roof, and they waited. And in the middle of the night, Polish men came. They were on horseback. They were carrying fire torches and shooting at the home, but the children were able to defend the home. One day, Lena went back to Krakow to pick up some provisions, and she overheard a man asking about his child. And she said to him, "Can you please describe what your daughter looks like?" And when he did, she said, "I think I have your daughter." She came back to the orphanage. She called me down to her office and said, "I have wonderful news to tell you. Your father has survived." I will always remember the reunion with my dad because I was so scared of him. He looked like a skeleton. He was hugging and kissing me and telling me he's going to take me away. I didn't want to go because for the first time I had friends. And Lena was our mother. We called her mother. My father was very sick. He wasn't able to take me right away. So he rented a room nearby. I would see him every day. We got reacquainted. And in time, he was able to take me. We went back to our village, and we moved in with several of my father's friends that survived. We moved into my grandparents' apartment. But we weren't safe there because there were notes posted on our front door that we would be murdered. Several of my father's friends were murdered after the war. 2 young men driving in a car, they were ambushed and shot. My father went to the police chief asking for protection, and the police chief said all he could do is to give my father a gun. So my father slept with a gun, and it became pretty clear that we couldn't stay there. So we left our town. We moved back to the city. And after a few months, maybe a couple, well, actually it was a couple of years, my father made a decision that we needed to leave Poland. It wasn't a simple matter as packing our bags and going. We had to get proper documentation. So my father had 2 brothers. One was living in Palestine and the other one in United States. And he came to me and asked me where I wanted to go. And I told him that I want to go to America because I heard that money grew on trees. So, of course, that was my fantasy. So it took about 2 years for us to get the proper documents. We had distant relatives in New Jersey. And basically those documents stated that if my father couldn't support himself and support me, that the family would take care of us so that we would never become a burden to this country and have to go on public assistance. So in March of 1947, we sailed on a marine transport boat. It was very rough crossing because the Atlantic is very stormy in March. I remember being very intrigued by vending machines, and I remember putting in a nickel and getting a Milky Way. And in those days, Milky Ways were very nice size. The other food I loved was red Jell-O. I had never seen Jell-O before, and I thought it was magical. So we settled in New Jersey, and I was almost 12 when I came. My uncle took me to school, elementary school. I had never been to school. I knew how to read and write in Polish, but I did not speak English. So he took me to school, and right there in the school office, he said, "What name do you want? You have to have an American name." So that question caught me by surprise. I thought for a minute, and I came up with the name Jeanette, because we had a French cousin. She lived in Paris, France. She visited us in the summertime. She was beautiful and glamorous, and she had long red nails, and her name was Jeanette. So I said, "I'd like my name to be Jeanette." My uncle said, "No, no, no, no. In English, it's Janet." So that's how I became Janet. So I was put into a 5th, 6th grade, but by the end of the school year, this was in April, but by June, I was promoted to 7th grade, which was the correct grade for me. I remember my 8th grade teacher always referring to me as that little foreign girl. I was trying to fit in, blend in, but that's how she referred to me. We also had a very serious problem because we came on a 90-day visitor's visa. In 90 days, we had another visa to go to Venezuela. The only way we could remain in this country is if my father married an American citizen. So the family looked around and they found him a wife. So that in that short period of time, I had a new stepmother, new name, new appearance because they cut my hair, new friends, new language, everything was new. I was very fortunate because I had really wonderful group of girlfriends in 8th grade who kind of took me under their wing, socialized me, helped me out. Then, of course, I went on to high school, and I was a good student. I made honor roll most of the time. My bad subject was geometry. I didn't do too well in that. But I was active. I was in I was in the school band, a French club. I wrote for the paper. I was in student government, and I graduated. And then I went to college. But at age 19, I got married. In those days, girls, young women, married young, and it was very difficult. I carried a baby to class, and I promised my parents I would finish college, and I kept my promise. So, I did it, but it was hard, and I don't recommend it to young people to marry so young. But so today, I have 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and I know when I'm no longer here that my legacy will continue because my children and grandchildren will continue to tell my story. Because I'm a witness of history, and now that you have heard my story, you all are witnesses. And I have a very special favor to ask of you. I hope that you will be able to tell my story and tell it to people who never heard me speak. The people that saved my life were generous and very courageous. They risked their own lives to save mine. Their actions did not just save my life, they saved the lives of future generations. So this has made me realize the importance of the choices and decisions we make, because even the smallest acts of kindness have a ripple effect. So I urge you to think about the kinds of decisions that you make. So I hope that all of us will speak out against any kind of injustice. Silence helps the aggressor. So let's all be upstanders and not bystanders. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Janet, for your wonderful presentation. I know I speak on behalf of our entire community. We so appreciate you taking the time to tell this story to people. And I also want to publicly thank the Mansfield Cultural Council for helping make sure that you can continue to do this presentation for our school and our community. So I do have some questions that people have been submitting. Again, I put up some instructions as well. You can also email. I will go and check my email and see if there are any additional questions as well. But I have a couple that came in. The first one was, why did the Polish people go to the field and other meeting places if they thought they might be killed?
Go to the field. I don't know if I understand that question.
So I think back in your talk when you were talking about how people were out in the field when at one point, was there maybe something along the lines of like, why would they even go out publicly to any meeting place if there was such a fear that they might be killed? Why do you think they may have done something like that?
You mean to protest or to? I'm a little confused.
Yeah, maybe to protest or just to kind of.
Well, there are people who are very passionate about their convictions and their what they believe in, and they're willing to take a chance and take a risk and do what they feel is right. And this same applies today with the protesters. They were very courageous to be doing this with the police right there. But they were passionate and convinced that this was the right thing to do.
Yeah, it's a good point. It certainly was a very dangerous time as well, given everything that was going on.
And the pandemic also.
Yeah.
That also was a risk.
I had another question that a student submitted. What was the food situation for you and your family during the time in the ghetto?
Well, they were given rations, and but the Jews were given fewer ration cards. So there was shortage of food.
Okay. Another student wondered if your health was ever seriously compromised by this whole.
Well, I never went to the dentist or to the doctor or had any shots, or I know that after the war I had rickets, which is like calcium deficiency. So in that sense, my health was, as a child, I was pretty healthy, but there were no services or possibilities of, preventive medicine.
Okay. Another student asks, where did all the anti-Semitic sentiment in Poland come from?
I think it came, sadly, from the Catholic Church that for centuries preached that Jews killed Jesus.
Yeah,
that was the original basis for the hatred.
I always find one of the things about your presentation that's so moving is when you talk about after the war, how people were still threatening the Jews. And one would think that after everything that had happened, that there would be some sort of moment like, oh my goodness, what have we done? And clearly like that speaks to a much deeper cause of all of this.
Right, definitely. And today, the current situation in Poland is also very difficult, very conservative government, and there is upsurge of anti-Semitism.
I have another question from a student. Did you ever have trouble sleeping either during or after this experience because of the fear and trauma you went through?
Oh, definitely yes. The answer is yes. And for a long, long time, I had nightmares and difficulty sleeping. Yes.
Um, the bigger question is, what do you think makes people decide to take a stand when they see some sort of injustice?
Um, I think it touches something in their hearts, and and maybe stirs up some anger, which makes you want to be more involved and more active. Maybe the teachings of their religion. I think there are probably different factors.
Yeah, as we know, like it can be very difficult for people to take a stand. And, sometimes we see, ordinary people who never thought that they would participate in something or come to the aid of someone in need. And all of a sudden they, become a hero. So it's certainly within all of us. And I think, we want to focus on those type of people. And clearly, like your presentation tells us that there are a lot of ordinary people out there who had never done something like that took matters into their own hands when they were faced with an injustice.
Right. And I think people who have suffered and for so long, I think it's like finally the pot was boiling. It was ready to erupt. People were just so fed up with having lived with so much hatred and injustice that they finally were able to, act
Yeah.
or be proactive.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Certainly we can see that today. One last question. So in your bio, it talks about how you did counseling for juvenile offenders that were convicted of hate crimes.
Yeah.
What made you decide to do something like that?
Well, I had worked with young people, and I often spoke in juvenile centers and detention centers, delinquents, and then the court contacted me, and I spoke to those people that were doing hate crimes.
Yeah. Did you ever get any type of breakthrough with them? Were you able to, successfully get them to show a little bit of remorse for what they did?
It wasn't sustained sufficiently. It was like once or twice, and there wasn't enough of a connection for me to see if I did make a difference. So I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you once again for presenting to our students this morning. And again, we look forward to having you come back again. Hopefully next year we'll be able to do this in person. But I want to thank you again on behalf of the entire Mansfield community. And for all of you watching this, if you think of questions later on, please go to Janet's website, janetapplefield.com. And you can feel free to submit any questions, any follow-up, any other information that you want. And again, thank you so much for presenting to our students and staff and school community this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Best to you and your family, and good health.
You too. Stay safe. Everybody stay healthy and safe.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.